A little girl had her own seat at the table, but she loved eating with her hands and would wander around, grabbing food wherever she went. Her family was so used to it that they didn't think much of it, but the new governess wasn't about to let it slide.
Viney, please bring Miss Sullivan another plate.
There's nothing wrong with my plate, Captain, only that Helen's hands don't belong in it.
One plate is hardly worth spoiling our breakfast over.
You see, she's just going to keep trying until she gets away.
I must insist that you let the girl go.
The governess had no choice but to let go, but the girl quickly tried to reach into her plate again. This time, the governess had enough and firmly held her to stop her from misbehaving. Frustrated, the girl threw herself to the ground, kicking and screaming, which immediately upset her parents. Her father even scolded the governess, saying she should be more compassionate since their daughter had been deaf, blind, and mute since birth. He insisted there was no... Thankfully, she reacted quickly and caught the girl just as she fell off the table. Breathing heavily, the governess carried the girl back to her seat and served her some food. The girl thought the governess had finally given in and immediately reached her hand into the plate again, only to be stopped once more. Eventually, the governess managed to scoop a bite of food with a spoon and feed it to the girl. For a moment, it seemed like she might quietly eat, but the next second, before the girl could react, the governess quickly fed her another spoonful of food. This time, the girl finally swallowed it without fuss. Seeing her improvement, the governess immediately used sign language to praise her for doing well. But to her surprise, the girl suddenly grabbed her hair in frustration. The governess had no choice but to teach her all over again. By the time the girl was finally allowed to leave the dining room, it was already noon. Stumbling her way out, she reached for her mother's arms, while the governess, equally exhausted, stepped out moments later. Just as the mother was about to criticize her for being too harsh, the governess interrupted and said,
Helen ate from her own plate, with a spoon, all by herself, and she folded her napkin.
The mother, who had been worried just moments ago, broke into tears of joy. She had never dared to dream that her daughter might one day learn to take care of herself. The girl's name was Helen Keller. She was born a healthy child into a wealthy family, but at 19 months old, she contracted scarlet fever. The illness robbed her of her hearing and sight, and gradually, she lost the ability to speak as well. From then on, Helen's world was enveloped in darkness and silence. Frustrated and unable to communicate, she grew increasingly irritable and prone to tantrums. The only way to calm her down, even briefly, was by giving her a piece of candy. The sweet taste would momentarily soothe her. But as she grew older, Helen's erratic behavior wore down her family's patience and energy. One day, she went so far as to push her baby brother to the ground. That was the final straw for her father. He decided Helen should be sent to a care facility to spend the rest of her days there. But her mother refused to give up. She firmly believed Helen's actions came from a desperate desire to communicate, not from malice. Holding on to this belief, she spent a significant amount of money to hire a governess named Annie from a school for the blind. On the way back home, Helen's brother asked Annie if she could first teach Helen how to be quiet. Annie, however, replied that Helen needed to learn the language first. If she doesn't understand language, Annie explained, how can she ever know what it means to be quiet? Hearing this, Helen's mother couldn't help but feel puzzled.
She can neither see nor hear, but if it is her senses that are impaired and not her mind, she must have language. Language is more important to the mind than light is to the eye.
Annie's response immediately filled the mother with hope. When they returned home, the entire family suggested that Annie take a moment to rest after her journey. However, she insisted on meeting Helen first. Their first encounter, however, didn't go as smoothly as expected. Although Helen was both deaf and blind, she still relied on her sense of touch and smell to recognize people. Realizing Annie was a stranger, she immediately snatched the teacher's suitcase. Helen's father wasn't impressed with Annie either. From the moment she stepped off the carriage, she hadn't taken off her sunglasses. Sensing his disapproval, the mother quickly explained that Annie had been visually impaired as a child and had nearly lost her sight entirely. It took 9 surgeries for her to regain partial vision. Even now, Annie still needed to wear sunglasses to protect her eyes from strong light. Hearing this, the father complained.
And they expect one blind person to teach another one? How long was she employed at that school?
Oh, she wasn't employed there. She was one of their best students.
Student?
Now you have 2 blind girls to take care of, Father.
You stay out of this.
Meanwhile, Helen had already opened Annie's suitcase and started rummaging through it. It wasn't until she found the doll Annie had brought for her that she finally calmed down. She carefully felt the doll's face, then touched her own, realizing they were similar. Delighted, she clung to the doll, unwilling to let go. Annie seized this opportunity and began spelling out the word doll with her fingers, guiding Helen to feel the shapes. To her surprise, Helen's memory and imitation skills were extraordinary. After just one demonstration, Helen accurately replicated the gestures for doll, leaving Annie overjoyed. However, Helen's brother poured cold water on her enthusiasm, dismissively saying that his sister was just like a monkey mimicking movements and didn't truly understand the meaning behind the gestures. Annie, unfazed, explained that imitation was the first step in learning. As long as Helen could learn to spell letters, she would eventually grasp their meanings. She then politely ushered the brother out of the room. Taking the doll from Helen's hands, Annie intended to continue the lesson, but Helen erupted into a tantrum. To soothe her, Annie took a piece of cake out of her bag. Helen's sharp sense of smell immediately picked up the sweet aroma. Annie broke off a small piece, fed it to her, and then taught her to spell cake. When Helen correctly mimicked the gestures, Annie rewarded her with a larger piece, hoping to show her that accurate gestures would get her what she wanted. Annie then returned to teaching the word doll. Though Helen resisted at first, she eventually complied and completed the task. But as soon as she got the doll back, she locked Annie in the room, snatched the key, and left. Coincidentally, her brother witnessed the entire scene. It wasn't until lunchtime that the parents learned Annie was trapped in the room. Helen's mother searched her thoroughly but couldn't find the key. With no other options, her father fetched a ladder and carried Annie out through the window. Later that day, when everyone had gone, Annie quietly approached Helen to see what mischief the little troublemaker would come up with next. Helen cautiously felt her surroundings, making sure no one was around, then pulled the hidden key out of her mouth.
Oh, you little devil.
This showed that Helen's mind was fine. However, figuring out how to discipline her without causing harm left Annie at a loss. In search of guidance, she decided to write a letter to the principal for help. Just then, Helen sneaked into the room and accidentally knocked over a bottle of ink on the table. While cleaning up the mess, Annie seized the opportunity to teach Helen how to spell ink. She even guided Helen's hand to try writing the word. Unexpectedly, Helen got pricked by the pen tip. The sudden pain sent her into a fit of rage, and she began smashing the doll. Hearing the commotion, Helen's mother hurried in, cleaning up the mess.
The captain thinks that you're spelling everything that Helen does is like spelling to a fence post.
Annie firmly stated that as long as Helen learned enough words, she would eventually understand. With that, Annie gently touched Helen's hand with the tip of her pen.
Did you see that? I spelled pen. She spelled cake. She wants to see if I can tell the difference. There is nothing impaired in that head, Mrs. Keller. Helen is smart and angry. I can use that.
Just as the two were talking, Helen suddenly poked Annie with the pen. Her mother quickly pulled her aside, but this only made Helen more agitated. In a hurry, her mother shoved a piece of candy into her mouth, which left Annie utterly confused.
Why did she get a reward for stabbing me?
I don't know. I'm sorry.